Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this ACER webinar on the Australian PISA results. My name is Gareth Lloyd. I'm Head of Communications at ACER and I'll chair today's webinar. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're running this webinar from today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I'd like to introduce you to our presenter today, Dr. Sue Thompson. Sue is ACER's Deputy CEO and PISA National Project Manager. Her career began as a mathematics teacher prior to joining ACER, where she is Research Director of the Australian Surveys Programme. Her role includes responsibility for national assessment programmes for schools, reporting of reading, maths and science, civics and citizenship, citizenship education and ICT literacy. These large-scale surveys include, of course, the current PISA study, IEA Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study, TIMSS, and IEA Progress in International Reading Literacy Study, PEARLS. In October 2018, Sue was elected to the Standing Committee of the International Association of the Evaluation of Educational Achievement, IEA. Sue will present for about 20 minutes today, and then we'll take questions. So just a moment and I'll explain how that works. Please add your questions by typing them into the question box you should see on your screen. That's on the dashboard. And I'll ask them of Sue on your behalf. You're actually joining in listen-only mode, and we'll use your submitted questions, not live audio, in the interests of time. So you can ask questions as you go, and Sue goes through the slides. I'll wait to the end of the slides and put the questions to Sue. Or if something comes to mind at the end of the slides, then pop that question in the box and I'll do my best to answer them in a period of about 20 minutes or so. So at this point, what I'm going to do is hand over to Sue to give the presentation. Sue.
Thank you very much, Gareth. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. This first webinar is looking at our reports for Volume 1 of the Australian Report, which is looking at Australian students' performance internationally and within the country. We will be doing another volume, Volume 2, which will be in March next year. We'll talk more about that later. I'm sort of mentioning at the start because I know that Volumes 2 and 3 of the OECD report are already out, and I noticed some reporters are talking about them today. So we're not doing very much on that at the moment. We're waiting until March to do a more in-depth analysis of that, similar to this report. So, why is this not working? Here we are. So, going through PISA 2018, altogether there were 79 participating countries and regions or economies. They're listed on the screen there. The OECD countries, all of the OECD countries, and quite a large number now of partner countries, including this one down here, I always get this wrong, BSJZ China, which is Beijing, Shanghai, Zhengzhou and Zhejiang. I've probably pronounced those wrong, but that's what they are. So they're 4 provinces of China, make up about 180 million people apparently. I'm not sure how many 15-year-olds, but quite a lot. And they're interesting because their average income is actually lower than the OECD average. Looking at it within Australia, we have we've got a random sample drawn in Australia that's stratified by state and territory, by sector, by by geographic location and by socioeconomic background of students roughly. So we have 56% of schools are government schools, 24% Catholic and about 20 independent. So 740 schools altogether, and you can see the number of students on the right-hand side of that slide. Of course, PISA is a sample assessment, just remembering that we don't test every 15-year-old, it would take too long, so it is a random sample. We extrapolate the results from that sample to all 15-year-old students. So there are approximately 258,000 15-year-old students in Australia, and these 14,273 represent those. This slide shows the assessment domains, a summary of the assessment areas. starting from PISA 2000, and the major domain is highlighted in each one of those. So if you remember, the major domain, there's a major domain and 2 minor domains every year, and we started off in 2000. Reading literacy was the most developed. It was the major domain. We did also assess maths and science, but we don't refer back to 2000 for those numbers. We refer back to 2003 for mathematical literacy. That was when it was assessed as a major domain, when the framework was completely developed, and then the same for science in 2006. So we look at our trend data that you'll see later on from 2000 for reading, from 2003 for mathematics, and from 2006 for science. And then in the following cycles, you'll see reading, maths and literacy, maths and science. So we've just started on the third cycle with the assessment of reading literacy for the third time. So although 79 countries participated in PISA as a computer-based assessment, we don't report all of these in the figures in the Australian report, largely for the sake of brevity and clarity of the figures. So we only report for those countries whose mean score is higher than the lowest performing OECD country, Mexico, and those are the ones presented in the figures. Also, the data for Spain in reading and for Vietnam in all domains have not been included in the OECD final report. So the total number of countries and economies varies by domain. Just as a reminder, the focus of the reports is on differences that are statistically significant. So if a difference is not significant, we don't talk about it. Therefore, you know that whatever we talk about as a difference is a significant difference. Just as a helpful cue, I think, the analysis of the PISA data indicate that one school year in Australia corresponds to an average of 33 points on the PISA reading literacy scale, 28 points on the mathematics literacy scale, and around 27 points on the scientific literacy scale. We can do this in Australia because we have students at years 8, 9, 10, and some even in year 11. So we can look at the approximate differences between each of those year levels. That's useful when we're talking about points because otherwise it's a little bit abstract. As you will know, the PISA data are scaled onto a mean of 500 and a standard deviation of 100. So this gives us a sort of a benchmark to work out how big the differences are. PISA also provides a profile of students' performance in each domain in the form of proficiency levels. So these are just categories summarising the skills that each student is able to display, and these are set out in the main report. Each domain has a number of different proficiency levels depending on its development, 8 for reading literacy, 6 for maths literacy, and 7 for science literacy. These levels are grouped to describe performance in different ways, and what we've done with this report in particular is we've looked at high performers, students who scored in the highest 2 proficiency levels and are therefore very proficient in that assessment domain. Low performers, which are students who scored below level 2 in reading literacy or mathematical or scientific literacy. That's the level at which students begin to demonstrate the competencies that will enable them to engage effectively and productively across a wider range of situations. That's set by the OECD as the minimum that students will need to actively engage in adult life in the 21st century. The National Proficiency Standard was set by ACARA as being level 3, and that represents a reasonably challenging level of performance that students need to demonstrate, where they need to demonstrate more than the minimal skills expected. So those are the 3 levels that we will generally be reporting on throughout this presentation, and we focus on those in the report as well to give you a bit more information. So having a look at the results, I'm sure you've probably all seen the results for all these subjects. They've been pretty well in the press the last couple of days. Overall, that's where we sit in reading. So I'll show a smaller figure of that in a moment, just so that you can see it in more detail. But it gives you a rough idea of where we are compared to the OECD mean. So in reading, we're in a second band of countries that's significantly higher than the OECD mean, and within a group that includes the United States, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and we're lower than those 4 provinces in China, Singapore, and a number of other countries that scored significantly higher than we did. So just making that a little bit bigger so you can see the countries above the OECD mean. So again, our score of 503 compared to the OECD average of 487. We are significantly higher than the OECD mean, but we aren't anywhere near, of course, the Chinese provinces or even Singapore in this. And it's about a year and a half in terms of, can I get that, the piece of bread? Can I get, it's about a year and a half lower than Singapore in terms of the number of years of schooling. And I have it there on the side. Australia's about 1.5 years, thank you. There are about 10 countries or economies whose performance was significantly higher than Australia's. There were 9 countries where it was not significantly different to Australia, and we outperformed 58 countries. So our performance was significantly higher than 58 countries. Looking at the reading literacy over time, you'll see that there's been not a huge decline, but a sort of slow and steady decline. We have gone down by about 26 score points since 2000, and that is a significant difference. There's not been any change since 2015, but we wouldn't expect that, and there's no. Reading wasn't the major domain in 2015, so we wouldn't necessarily expect that. Okay. Yes, so I think I'm just repeating that. So in 2009, it was a major domain. Score declined to 515 points, and in 2018 to 503 points. So this represents about a 3/4 of a year school decline. Three-quarter of a year of schooling decline between 2000 and 2018. Students in 4 countries, Canada, Hong Kong, Ireland, Korea, performed at a similar level to Australia in 2000, but outperformed Australia in 2018. Those in 7 countries, so Chinese Taipei, Denmark, Germany, Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom and the United States, were outperformed by Australia in previous cycles, but performed at the same level as Australia in 2018. So this is to show you that while we've been on a slow sort of downward trajectory, other countries have been going up at the same time. So looking at the proportion of high performers and low performers, you can see here Australia, 20% of Australian students are low performers in reading literacy, which is lower than the OECD average of 23%. About 13% are high performers in reading literacy, which is higher than the OECD average of 9%. But compared to the Chinese provinces, there's a very different story there. And looking at the number of students, the percentage of students who achieve the National Proficiency Standard, 59% of Australian students, if they were to sit the same or be held to the same standard, 54% of students across the OECD would achieve that standard, but 80% of those in China, in those 4 provinces of China would also achieve that standard. Over time, just to summarise the reading literacy, over time our average performance has dropped by 26 points. Our proportion of low performers has gone up by 7 percentage points. Our proportion of high performers has gone down by 4 percentage points, and the proportion of students who attain the National Proficiency Standard has gone down by 10 percentage points. Looking at the results for science, again where we sit in terms of the whole OECD and other countries down to Mexico. So we're still in that second band. We're significantly higher than the OECD average. And there it is in more detail. So Australia's score was more than 3 years of schooling lower than the highest performing economy, the Chinese provinces, and about 1 3/4 years lower than the highest performing country, Singapore. There were 12 countries whose performance was significantly higher than Australia's, 7 whose performance was not significantly different to Australia's, so that's that band from Slovenia, United Kingdom, Netherlands, Germany, US, Sweden and Belgium. You'll notice New Zealand is significantly higher than Australia. And there were 59 countries whose performance was significantly lower than Australia's. Over time, you can see again this sort of steady decline in scores, and the change has been by about 24 points. So in 2006, when we first assessed scientific literacy, Australia achieved a mean score of 527 points. In 2015, when it was again a major domain, the score had declined to 510 points, and in 2018 to 503 points. So this represents almost one full school year decline from 2006 to 2018. High performers and low performers. 19% of Australian students are low performers in scientific literacy. Again, this was lower than the OECD average of 22%, but nowhere near the Chinese average of 2%. 9% of Australian students are high performers in scientific literacy, higher than the OECD average of 7%, but the average for the Chinese provinces was 32%. 58% of our students achieved the National Proficiency Standard in scientific literacy, whereas 90% of the students in those 4 provinces of China would have achieved that same standard. Comparative performances over time. Students in Estonia, Japan, Korea and New Zealand were performed on a par with Australia in previous cycles, but in this cycle, 2018, outperformed Australia. Students in Macau, China and Poland were actually outperformed by Australia in previous cycles, but outperformed Australia in 2018. And students in 6 countries, so Belgium, Germany, Slovenia, Sweden, United Kingdom and the United States, were outperformed by Australia in previous cycles, but have caught up and are on par with Australia in 2018. So again, the same pattern of us slowly declining, a number of other countries improving their scores over the same period of time. Average performance, looking overall scientific literacy, was down 24 points, 6 percentage points more lower performers. Proportion of high performers decreased by 5 percentage points, and the proportion who attained the National Proficiency Standard also decreased by 9 percentage points. Okay, maths. Now you will know from reading the newspapers and listening, I'm sure, that the maths story has not been good. For the first time, since we've been doing PISA, since we've been measuring maths in 2003, for the first time, Australia is at the OECD average. And there are a very large group of countries who performed significantly better than we did. So looking at that, again, no significant difference to the OECD average, and a large number of countries who've done better than we have. Countries like all of the big East Asian countries, Estonia, Poland, Switzerland, Canada, Denmark, and so on. United Kingdom, Ireland. So countries similar to us, as well as countries that are quite different to us. Achieving at the same level are a group of other countries as well. So for the first time, as I said, mathematical literacy score is not higher than the OECD average. Australia was the equivalent of 3.5 years of schooling lower than the highest performing economy, and around 3 years lower than the highest performing country, which was Singapore again. There were 23 countries whose performance was significantly higher than Australia's, 8 countries whose performance was not significantly different to Australia's, and 47 countries whose performance was significantly lower than Australia's. Over time, the maths one is a little steeper. We started off in 2003 with an average score of 524 points. The OECD average I think was 499 or 500 at that time. In 2012, when it was again a major domain, the score had declined to 504 points, and in 2018 to 491 points. This represents a decline from 2003 to 2018 of about 1.25 school years in mathematics. So looking at the comparative performance, students in Belgium, Czech Republic, Estonia, Macau, China and Switzerland were on a par with Australia in their first PISA cycles, but outperformed Australia in 2018. Those in 9 countries, Austria, Denmark, Germany, Ireland, Norway, Poland, Slovenia, Sweden and UK, were outperformed, but have now outperformed Australia. And 7 students in 7 countries, France, Iceland, Italy, Latvia, Portugal, the Russian Federation, the Slovak Republic, were outperformed by Australia in their first PISA cycle, but have caught up and are now on par with Australia. The only country that's declined as much as Australia is Finland, and their score still remains significantly higher than ours. Low performers and high performers. 22% of our students are low performers in mathematical literacy, still lower than the OECD average of 24%, but there's only 2% in those Chinese provinces that fall into that category. 10% of our students are high performers, no different to the OECD average of 11%, but very different to 44% in the Chinese provinces again. And 54% of our students attain the National Proficient Standard, same as the OECD average. 91% in China would have achieved that same standard. Flipping that around, that means 46% of our students did not achieve the National Proficient Standard, and I think that's quite a worrying feature as well. So our average performance over time is down by 33 points, 8 percentage points higher, a higher proportion of low performers, 9 percentage points fewer high performers, and 13 percentage points lower proportion of students attaining that National Proficient Standard. Looking at differences between the jurisdictions, ACT scored the highest mean score of 535. The next highest were Western Australia and Victoria, and then Queensland, South Australia 496. And you can see the proportion of low performers, proportion of high performers, and the proportion of students who attained the National Proficient Standard in each of those states. So from 70% in the ACT down to 50% in Tasmania and the Northern Territory. In mathematical literacy, again, similar order of states, 66% of ACT students attaining the National Proficient Standard, down to 43% in Tasmania and the Northern Territory, where there's about a third of students who are classed as low performers, and only 6 and 8% who are high performers. In scientific literacy, again, similar pattern for the states, and attaining the National Proficient Standard, 71% in the ACT, down to 49% in the Tasmania and the Northern Territory, and a quarter of students in Tasmania and more than a quarter in Northern Territory classed as low performers. Change in performance over time. This one might be a little bit more difficult to read, but it's a summary, and it's in the PISA in Brief document, so you can have a look at it in more detail. Pretty much in every state, the scores have gone down, other than Victoria. Victoria, they've gone down in mathematical literacy by 14 points, which is the smallest decline of all of the states. But if you have a look, there's some pretty big changes in some of the other states. So in South Australia in particular, there are really big drops, particularly in mathematical literacy. There more in some of the other states. There are fewer changes over time in reading literacy, and in some of the states in scientific literacy as well. Generally, across the states, the proportion of low performers has increased, other than in quite strikingly there, Victoria, no changes. The proportion of high performers has decreased in most states, and the proportion of students achieving the National Proficient Standard has gone down in most states in most subject areas. Looking at sex differences, the differences between girls and boys in reading literacy, 65% of female students achieved the National Proficient Standard compared to 54% of male students, and you can see the differences in the proportion of low performers in particular. High performers less so, 15 to 11, but 15 to 24% in low performers. In mathematical literacy, very few differences at the bottom end, 23 and 22, but more of a difference at the higher end. So 12% of males achieving classed as high performers compared to 9% of females. In scientific literacy, things are a little more even, just a little bit more in terms of males at the lower end and at the higher end. Changes in performance over time for males and females, so both have declined in all subject areas, as you can see, and again the same sort of patterns. The proportion of low performers has increased for both males and females. The proportion of high performers has decreased for both males and females. And the proportion of students who attain the National Proficient Standard has decreased in reading and science literacy, but not in mathematics. Changes in performance over time, I'll go back, by socioeconomic background. I'm just putting in the summary tables from here on, and you'll be able to see these in more detail in the PISA in brief. Looking at students, again, there is a really huge gap between students in the lowest quartile and students in the highest quartile. So the difference between the two groups is around three school years. But this shows the changes in performance over time and shows that in mathematical literacy, the change has been about 28 points in mathematics in the lowest quartile, but about 40 points in the highest quartile. So the decline is at the lower quartiles and the higher quartiles, so it's right across the distribution. At the same time, in mathematics in particular, but in the other two subject areas as well, the proportion of low performers has increased. The proportion of high performers has decreased in maths and science across all quartiles, but only in the highest quartile for reading. And the proportion who achieve the National Proficient Standard has decreased for everybody, basically. Looking at changes in performance by school sector, we've only reported this since 2009, so all of our baselines are from 2009 to 2018. Average performance has declined for the government sector in mathematical literacy and scientific literacy, but it's declined by the same amount pretty much in Catholic schools and independent schools as well, possibly by a little bit more in scientific literacy in independent schools. The proportion of low performers again has increased in all sectors. The proportion of high performers has decreased in mathematics and scientific literacy for all sectors, and similarly for the proportion attaining the National Proficient Standard other than reading literacy, where the only change was the proportion of independent school students achieving the National Proficient Standard, which declined by 5 percentage points. So the key findings, there's a huge amount more in the report, but our key findings are these. The continued decline in reading is a concern, particularly given the changes in the reading framework over time. In the past, reading was mainly about extracting knowledge from linear texts in established sources. When we did the first PISA assessment in 2000, it was done pen and paper, and students answered questions from those booklets. When we're talking about this, we're talking about differences such as when students didn't know the answer to a question in the past, the teachers could direct them to look into an encyclopedia and the answer would be trustworthy. Today, we can have digital search engines. If we put something in, it could provide students with millions of answers. and it's actually up to the students to figure out what's accurate and what's misleading and potentially dangerous. PISA is now adapted and is changing what it assesses to test how students navigate multiple source texts, how they deal with ambiguity, distinguish between fact, opinion and sensationalism, and how they triangulate different sources to construct knowledge. It does that at the same time as maintaining a link to the 2000 assessment so that we can keep the trend from that assessment carefully. In maths, the continued decline in maths is extremely concerning, and to have actually achieved at the OECD average when that's also declined since 2003 is a concern. We've looked at this, and the slide is across the whole continuum of achievement at each percentile. The proportion of low performers has increased, the proportion of high performers has decreased. This is happening at all socioeconomic levels in all school sectors and in most states. These data reflect the TALIS data showing that many teachers are not confident about the content they're teaching despite having covered it in their training. And as a question, is it also linked to the number of maths teachers teaching out of field, for which I've seen various figures over the last 2 days of between 50% and 30%. The full report, released on the 3rd of December, of course, contains a great deal more than what we've been able to present in this one webinar. Volume 2, Context and Achievement, will be available in March 2020. It will be based on the OECD reports 2 and 3, and we'll look at all the demographic details and the contextual details that the OECD have collected, that we've collected through PISA. And for more information about PISA, these are our contact details. Please contact the National PISA team, pisa@acer.org, and that's 1800 280 625. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sue. So now your opportunity to ask some questions. So as I said, would you put any questions in that box if you haven't already done so? And I will ask them of Sue. Just to point out that I won't identify anybody as a questioner in the interest of time, and I might combine some questions for the same reason. We will record the webinar, or are recording it, and we'll make it available on the ACER PISA website in a couple of days. So if colleagues have not been able to listen in today, you can come to the website in a couple of days' time. So look, I'm going to kick off, Sue, with questions. Okay, so we're probably a bit slow on that. Maybe you're taking all the data in. One of the questions that perhaps has been coming up in the last couple of days of media inquiries is the Chinese provinces. Sue, isn't that a little bit of an artificial construct, because that's clearly not the whole of China, whereas other countries, Australia, UK, US or whatever, are. So it's a bit of a construct. Have you got any comments on that?
It is a bit of a construct, and we've sort of been looking at this over the last few years since Shanghai first participated in PISA. Shanghai participated as itself for a couple of years, and then in the last cycle there were 4 provinces, and this time one of those provinces has dropped out and another one has replaced it. I think that we should remember that always that this isn't the whole of China, and that we can't necessarily make comparisons to it with the whole of China. There's a couple of others in there as well. There's Baku in Azerbaijan that's also participated by itself. So I think we just have to be a little bit careful about those things. However, as far as we know, the sampling is done exactly the same. There's been a lot of reports that say, you have to ignore these Chinese provinces because they select their students. As far as we know, they don't select their students. They don't select the schools or the students that participate. As far as we know, and the procedures that we follow with the OECD are that the independent samplers, they select the samples and then they select a sample from within those schools. So we don't know exactly what they do, but the OECD do send out quality monitors to check these things. But we know within Australia, we collect our data absolutely according to the guidelines.
And another question here about samples. How confident are you that other countries' samples are truly random beyond what you've just talked about?
Well, no, I think it's just as I talked about. I think that I would have to be extremely confident of most of the countries, I would think. As I said, we don't know exactly what goes on in every country. However, there are very strict guidelines on sampling and on procedures, and so we have to assume that that's exactly what's happening in other countries as well.
Okay, and could we actually say then that the low performers were actually not literate or numerate? Is that fair?
No, we can't say that they're not literate or numerate. They are probably quite literate or numerate. It's just that they're not able to show the level of skills and the level of interpretation skills that the OECD expects of students at that level. So they are literate and numerate, but you have to remember PISA is not a test of curriculum, and so it's not assessing basic recall of facts. It's assessing how well students are able to interpret those facts and apply those things to real-world solutions. So that's the difference between literacy and numeracy and what's examined in PISA.
Okay, and another question here on the mathematics question, which you raise is an issue. Performance has declined. Is the amount of time we're spending on teaching mathematics, particularly in the first 2 years of secondary schooling, a potential factor in our declining results? And how does the number of hours that we spend teaching in Australia in different states compare to other countries? I think this is going beyond what the data that you've got in here.
I think that's going a little bit beyond the brief, but to answer the second part of the question, PISA doesn't look at those sort of things and can't answer that sort of question. However, the TIMS Encyclopedia does look at those sort of things and can look at you can find information about some of those questions. In terms of whether it's because of the amount of teaching time, I don't know the answer to that, and certainly our data can't tell us that. In terms of the number of hours of reading, we will be reporting on that in the second volume of the report.
Thanks. So why is the data from PISA not showing the same story as NAPLAN data over the same time period? To what extent do students in different countries source learning outside of the formal education system, e.g. coaching and so on?
To answer the first part of the question, you're right, PISA is showing a difference between, it is different to NAPLAN results. I guess that my answer would be that they're measuring different things. The NAPLAN is measuring more recall, it's measuring more of basic understanding of literacy, reading and numeracy, for example, whereas PISA is looking at applications of that. In terms of other things, it's probably a little bit outside my brief to comment on that.
There's an interesting question here. I wonder if the reading questions are in English in all countries. In Finland, for example, are the questions in reading in English or in Finnish?
That's a good question. No, the questions in every country are translated into the language of instruction. So in English-speaking countries, obviously they're in English. In Finland, if the language of instruction is Finnish, they're translated into Finnish. They're very carefully translated, checked and back-translated by another independent company. But in every country, the students look at and answer questions that are written in their language of instruction.
And this is going on a bit, but do you see any correlation between the performance data and the data that's been published on class discipline that we've heard about?
We haven't looked at that in depth for Australia yet. The reports on class discipline, there's no direct link to performance because we can't make those direct links. There is, of course, a correlation because we have large numbers of students. It's interesting though with that with those data that have been published from the OECD, if we compare those to the TALIS data that were also published by the OECD using another large sample, but this time of teachers of students between year 7 to 10, teachers don't seem to think there's as much of a problem as students report. So there's a very big discrepancy between those two about noise and misbehaviour in the classroom. Whether that's connected to PISA students generally being 15-year-olds, which can be a problem. If people are secondary teachers, they'll know that 15-year-olds can sometimes be problematic. Whether it's connected to that, and the other is more broad, looking at 7 to 10, we're not sure of, and the PISA TALIS link might be able to shed light onto that. That'll be published next year, or the year after next.
In Australia, students whose first language is not English are disadvantaged, ? Could this also affect the reading results of Australia? It's probably going into a bit of depth.
I'm just looking at the report. Yes, students whose language at home is other than English. There's sort of two groups of those. There's still quite a substantial proportion of high performers. For example, in reading literacy, there's 14% of students whose English spoken at home, and 13% of those whose language is other than English were high performers, and 18% of English spoken at home were low performers. 27% of those were high performers of students whose language was other than English. So there is a bigger proportion there who are disadvantaged or maybe not reading as fluently. But in mathematics, it's a little bit different, because in mathematics there's actually a higher proportion of students whose language is other than English at home. There's a higher proportion who are in the high performers and a higher proportion who are in the low performers. So that's probably the difference between refugee students, for example, and perhaps economic migrants who are coming here for further education. Also, even in scientific literacy, proportion of high performers is almost the same. Proportion of low performers is a little bit higher for those students whose language other than English is spoken at home. So they certainly need more support, but then in many cases they're outperforming our other students. And just as a check, students can be excluded from the assessment if they've not spoken English for 3 years in total. So it's not like we have children who come in and are in their first year of learning in Australia and suddenly get thrown into the school system and into PISA.
So joining on to the literacy point, somebody's asked a question, mathematical literacy assessment, are students disadvantaged in that assessment if they find reading in English difficult? So the mathematical questions, but they find difficulty in reading in English difficult. Will they be disadvantaged?
That could be the case. We can have a look at that. We haven't looked at that at the moment. We've been trying to get the report out. But we can certainly have a look at that. In the past, I think we've looked at that. There's certainly a correlation between achievement in reading and achievement in the other two subject areas, and there's certainly some reading load in both mathematics and science. But we'll have a look at that, and maybe we'll be able to publish something early in the new year following that up.
Probably a simple yes-no question. Are questions presented using metric or imperial depending on the country? Will it be relevant simply to US, UK, whatever?
That is a yes. Yes, they are presented in metric other than those countries who don't use metrics.
Okay. And can you comment on how does PISA manage cultural biases in the design of the items in terms of terminology and context?
All of the items and the materials are reviewed by all national project managers at various meetings. So anything that is culturally biased is flagged and reviewed and can be adapted. So everything's reviewed by national project managers from every country so that anything that's culturally sensitive or inappropriate is removed or modified from the assessment.
Okay, look, I'm conscious of time. We've already run over. So what I'd like to say is thank you to everyone for questions. Perhaps because it's been out a day or two, they're quite detailed and comprehensive questions, so we've done our best to answer them in the time. What I would say is, first of all, look, just reminding you that we'll provide a recording of this on our PISA website within a couple of days. But also, if you've got any questions, please send them to us. You'll see that on the screen in a moment. We'll just put that up. Send them to us and we'll endeavour to answer them for you. So pop that in an email. There's also a phone number provided for the AusPISA line. So it's either emailing pisa@acer.org or the 1800 280 625 number. So do put those through to us, and we look forward to doing these webinars again as the further reports come out. So I'd like to finish by thanking you very much for your questions and thanking Sue on your behalf for running this session today. Thank you very much.